Good morning and welcome to Lesson 8. Today we're going to be constructing a strong introduction paragraph. Before we get started, I just want to note that as you're thinking about the strong introduction paragraphs, we are primarily going to be using the terms a good intro versus a great intro. And that I wanted to spell out kind of what do I mean by that. A good intro is going to have the essentials. It's going to have the foundational elements of what the passage is about. So the rhetorical situation will be outlined in that introduction. It is done quickly, and that is because we're preparing for that timed rhetorical analysis essay. It also is going to reflect competent knowledge of the task. So it's going to respond to the prompt in a way that accurately answers the prompt. It gets the job done. It is a good intro. I like to think of a good intro as a cheese pizza. I love a cheese pizza. It's good. But the difference between a good intro and a great intro is that a great intro has more enrichment. It's going to take a little bit more time, and it's often going to reflect more sophistication. So it's going to go beyond the basics of just this is the rhetorical situation, and here is my thesis statement. It's often going to contain a little bit more context about either the topic that is being discussed. So for example, like women and equality, in the Madeleine Albright passage, or it might go beyond and have a little bit more context about the time period, as we saw in the sample essay for the Abigail Adams piece. So when we talk about a great intro, we're talking about more than just a cheese pizza. It's like the supreme pizza. It's got all the toppings, and you'll definitely notice that it's got more sophistication to it. So for today's lesson, we're going to be constructing introductions for a rhetorical analysis essay. The introduction of an argument introduces the subject and/or writer of the argument to the audience. An introduction may present the argument's thesis. An introduction may orient, engage, and/or focus the audience by presentation quotations, intriguing statements, anecdotes, questions, statistics, data, contextualized information, or a scenario. And ultimately, every introduction could look different. But there are some key fundamentals that we want to make sure we include in our introductions in order to be accurately answering the prompt and in order to show stronger sophistication in our writing if we're working toward that sophistication point. Ultimately, though, this is a timed essay. So what we want to do is we want to spend 5 minutes on our introduction. And we want to limit ourselves so that we're spending the bulk of our time on our body paragraphs where we're able to prove our analytical skills and our deep thinking about that writer's passage. So here I've kind of spelled out what College Board says is desirable when writing an introduction. And I want to note this because while the introduction paragraph is not a standard on the rubric, it is often assessed in that sophistication point. This is the first place where your writer, one of the College Board readers for the exam, the person who's grading your exam, is going to be introduced to your writing. So it's important that we make a strong first impression. It's also important that we are very clear with our argument, whatever our thesis might be, and that that thesis guides the rest of our paper. So the introduction is incredibly important, and that's why we're spending an entire lesson focusing specifically on how to make our introductions not just good, but great. So to get us started for today, I want you to pause the recording and become familiar with the prompt that we're going to be using for the teacher-guided practice today. You have already read this prompt and you've read this passage, but sometimes it's helpful to reread and familiarize ourselves with this. Then you're going to read the 2 sample introductions. Identify the similarities between them. So for example, you may have already noticed one similarity is that both introductions clearly state the speaker of the passage, and that is Madeleine Albright. And so you'll notice, and you can even jot this down or go ahead and highlight both of these in those 2 samples, that Albright is in both samples. So pause the recording, reread the prompt, and then read the 2 sample introductions, and then highlight in yellow the similarities that exist between them. Welcome back. On my screen, you will see the similarities highlighted in both of the 2 sample introduction paragraphs. Right now I'm going to read both of these to you, and I'm just going to take note of some of the things that I've highlighted that are similar in both. And so please check your work. If your work is different, change your answer. This teacher-guided practice is meant to guide your independent practice, so it's important that you have an accurate model to go back to, that your notes are accurate. United States Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, in her 1997 speech to the graduating class of Mount Holyoke College, proposes that everyone strive to make an impact, even if met with opposition. She articulates her proposition by firstly alluding to recent accomplishments in history across the world, then by shifting to an encouraging rebuttal regarding doubt, and finally by calling her audience to action in the name of progress. Albright's purpose is to inspire courage and faith in individuals in order to promote human progress. She adopts an encouraging tone for her audience. Okay, next we're going to look at this other one. I'm going to read this to you as well. You're still noting kind of the similarities that I already have highlighted. Madeleine Albright's commencement speech in 1997 at Mount Holyoke College came at a time of peace and prosperity for American society. However, in the speech, she urges her audience to seek out problems that still exist in the world and help fix them. By referencing the efforts of marginalized women who are fighting to make a difference, utilizing powerful diction and repetition, and illustrating American efforts to improve the world even further, Albright inspires a young generation of graduate students on the brink of adulthood with the future in their hands to never settle. Always persevere and fight to elevate the status of women around the world. So you'll notice the similarity between these, and I've kind of highlighted those for you. We see that the writers, both writers mentioned the speaker, Madeleine Albright. Some go into more detail about who she is and kind of why she is powerful and appealing to her audience. And then you'll also notice they provide some context. 1997, it is given at Mount Holyoke College, and that it is a speech. You see in both that they do reference the genre of the text. We also note that both of these introductions highlight the rhetorical situation, the speaker, the context, the purpose, and her overall message is definitely spelled out in this text, in these introductions. And so that is super important for you to note and to include in your own introduction paragraphs when writing for the rhetorical analysis essay. Here, College Board is really looking for an introduction that orients, engages, or focuses the audience by providing some sort of contextualized information. The best way to orient or focus your introduction is to introduce the text. You are writing about a specific text that was given to you, so whether it was a personal letter that was written by Abigail Adams to her son, or whether it was a speech given to a graduating class of all women students, it's important that you introduce the genre of that text and that you introduce the rhetorical situation. You have the rhetorical situation already spelled out often in your prompt. And so again, when we take that 3 minutes to read the prompt and dive into, okay, what are the rhetorical elements? What's the context? Who's the speaker? Who's the audience? And what's the message? It's important to go ahead and include that in your introduction as well, because your reader needs that context. And then again, the most important part, which all of your English teachers have stressed over and over again, is that you include a thesis. And in the rubric that is given by College Board, the thesis needs to analyze the rhetorical choices. So we're going to take a minute to read what is considered to be a good introduction. It is not great, it is good. And so what I want you to do is take 3 minutes, read the introduction, and then I want you to identify the rhetorical situation within this introduction. You may pause the video so that you can kind of take time to think. Here you have kind of my annotated version of that introduction, that good introduction. And so I'm going to read this to you, and you can kind of notice where I've pointed out elements of the rhetorical situation. So in her 1997 commencement speech to Mount Holyoke College, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright connects with her audience through parallel syntax, repetition, assertions, and other tactics to convince her audience that they have an opportunity to change the world and break through the glass ceilings around them. The first thing that you note is we're already setting up the context. It's in 1997. It is a commencement speech, which is the exigence. That's why she's writing it, because she's kind of congratulating this graduating class and writing to inspire them. The writer is Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, so we already know that as well. And her purpose is to convince. So you see that that active verb choice here, to convince her audience that they have that opportunity to change the world. And that leads us into her message. The difference between a good intro and a great intro, when we talk about focusing and engaging with our audience, is the great intro is going to relate to the issues and the context. So for example, in the Madeleine Albright piece, you might notice that the writer would start with a lot of context about women's rights or the history of women's rights, maybe something about like how long it took women to get the right to vote, and some of the things that they've faced in our society. It also is going to incorporate the rhetorical situation in more depth. And so we might see elements of the writer more spelled out. So not just that it's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, but what about her values, beliefs, and needs are she seen in this passage? And maybe that's included a bit in the introduction. A great intro also demonstrates controlled writing. And when I say controlled writing, these introductions have really bold ideas. They do not just leap in logic, which means they don't just make a sweeping assumption, but it's a bold idea that they can support. And they often have highly stylized or vivid language. And we're going to see an example of that in just a second. Okay, so now I want you to read this great introduction, and I want you to take 3 minutes, read the introduction, and then I want you to identify the rhetorical situation and elements that make this great introduction great. So just like we took notes earlier on ways to engage the reader in a way that kind of crafts like a really strong, great intro. It relates to the issue's context. It incorporates rhetorical situation in more depth, or it has those bold ideas. Find in this introduction where the student is doing that. So pause the video and go ahead and identify what makes this great introduction great. Welcome back. So now you can see my annotated elements of what makes this great introduction great. So the first thing I want to start us off with is I'm going to read this out loud to you, and I'm going to highlight elements that make it really strong. We have come a long way since women gained voting rights. Yet we have not gone far enough as gender equality remains an issue unresolved. The glass ceiling remains unbroken, and women continue to fight on all fronts for rights they deserve, rights that should be inherent. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, in her speech to the women graduating from Mount Holyoke College, emphasizes the need to continue the struggle and strive for gender equality. By contrasting hypotheticals and reality, providing examples and personal anecdotes, and strong repetition of the word perseverance, Albright successfully conveys her message to these graduates that they must continue to fight for rights in the face of opposition and that they will succeed. The first thing I want to point out is that the student starts with context about the issues. That we've come a long way since women have gained the right to vote, and yet it's not far enough, just because we have so many gender equality issues remaining. The second sentence that is highlighted in red really points out the student's bold ideas and the student's ability to invoke style. And we see that with this like image of the glass ceiling remains unbroken, which is kind of an interesting take on how women still have not been able to break all of the oppression, the bounds that hold them through oppression, and that they continue to fight on all fronts for rights they deserve, rights that should be inherent. And the repetition of this rights they deserve, rights that should be inherent. The style is pretty vivid. And so we can clearly kind of picture this as the reader. And it transitions nicely into Madeleine Albright. So next we see the rhetorical situation where the student goes ahead and just acknowledges who the writer is, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and the context that she's giving a speech to the women graduating from Mount Holyoke College. So again, addressing the audience, emphasizing the need to continue the struggle and strive for gender equality, and acknowledging Madeleine Albright's overall message. So by contrasting hypotheticals and reality, providing examples of personal anecdotes and strong repetition of the word perseverance, we also see that the student is starting with a strong thesis, where the student is kind of highlighting the rhetorical choices that the author is making, and then stating the author's purpose in using those rhetorical choices. And it's to convey her message and ending with that message. You'll notice that elements of a good introduction are here as well. Thesis, rhetorical situation. If we had started just with this highlighted portion, like let's say this was just the intro, this would be considered a good introduction. It has the rhetorical situation, it provides enough information for the reader to understand what's going on, and then it goes into a thesis. But by adding the context about the issues and by adding this sentence of style, with the image of the glass ceiling remaining unbroken and the repetition of these rights that people deserve, this context and style engages the reader so much more. And that's what really turns this introduction into a great introduction. So for your independent practice, I want you to read each sample introduction paragraph, determine which paragraph is good and which paragraph is great. In the space provided, please explain your reasoning. In your reasoning, make sure you're including specific examples from the introduction paragraph and the components of a good and great introduction from your notes. So when I say components of a good and great introduction, you should have taken notes on kind of what sets up a good and great introduction. This was kind of our broad overview. And then we went more into depth of like, okay, well, how do we make it great? Like we include issues of context, or we relate to those issues that are surfacing in the piece itself. And so if you need to go back through the video to kind of see those, to take those notes, that's okay too. But please make sure you're completing the independent practice. All right, many of you have finished up the independent practice and you're ready to move into that mastery check. But before you do that, I just want to stamp what we talked about in today's lesson with a good versus great intro. Again, please take these notes if for some reason you don't have these in already. I would go back and make sure that you have exactly like what's on the screen so that you have this reference for yourself. A good introduction includes approximately 4 elements of the rhetorical situation. Again, that's approximately 4 elements. Don't force an element if it's not explicitly there. Like, for example, if you're not quite sure of the context, I think that's okay. Just try your best to address who the speaker is and who the audience is and the purpose and the message. It includes a thesis. The thesis is the most important part, arguably the most important part of your essay, because that's what's driving the rest of your essay. It keeps it focused and it keeps it defensible. And number 3, a good intro is approximately 2 to 3 sentences in length. Most students write a good intro, and that is because of the time constraint. And so today we're kind of focusing on, well, how do we make our good intro great? And can we do that in a time setting? A great introduction is going to include a bit more about the rhetorical situation. So it might have 5 elements of the rhetorical situation, or it's going to address the elements of the rhetorical situation in more depth. So for example, it's going to reveal more about the speaker and her values and her beliefs and how her point of view kind of drives her argument toward the audience. Number 2, it's going to include a thesis, which we will go more in depth. We will talk more about tomorrow. It's approximately 3 to 5 sentences. So it's a little longer because it often contains a bit more context. And number 5, it demonstrates controlled writing through bold ideas or highly stylized or vivid language. So it might include like a very vivid image that helps the writer kind of paint this picture of oppression or paint this picture of obstacles that the audience may face. And then 6, a great introduction might also include 1 or more of the following: reference to broader context, incorporates like a very vivid style. It might include a scenario, or it could include a striking or a very bold statement. So absolute must-haves for any introduction. We have to provide some sort of introduction to the topic. So whatever the topic is, whether it's perseverance, whether it is Abigail Adams writing to convey to her son that experience is worth it, it really does need to address the message of the piece or the purpose of the piece. It also needs to address elements of the rhetorical situation. Your writer should not be left questioning, well, who wrote this, or what are they even analyzing? Your writer should have a clear understanding of the rhetorical situation, and again, it has to have a stated thesis. Your mastery check today is to reread the Margaret Thatcher prompt and passage. We have read this in the past, and I would like for you to compose an introduction paragraph for the following prompt. And again, our prompt is: on June 11, 2004, Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, delivered the following eulogy to the American people in honor of former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, with whom she had worked closely. Read the passage carefully, write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical strategies that Thatcher makes to convey her respect for Reagan. Here is my suggestion. My suggestion is that you take 5 minutes, because you do want to practice that time setting, and you write a good introduction. Then, because this is for a mastery check and we are practicing going from good to great, take an additional minute or 2 or 3 minutes to proofread the introduction you wrote and add details to make it a great introduction. Add that context, or add, that striking language that will make it stronger. So you might want to revise some of the word choices that you've used. And then once you're finished, submit. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always available to help.